Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for everyone for being here at our Lunch and Learn today. This Lunch and Learn is something that we've been working on now for maybe like 2 months, right? And I'm so excited that we're finally able to do this. It is called Diversity Beyond Policy, and we are going to be reflecting a little bit on the intersections between human rights and the labor law. My name is Stenette Berg. I am a program and policy coordinator with the LSN, and I'm very excited to welcome everyone from wherever it is that they find themselves. My pronouns are she, her, and we are joined by our wonderful panelists, 2 in person here with me, and a third virtually, Lisa Spencer, Odessa, and Murielle Jassinthe. So we are so glad to have you here, and we have a few people in the office and then several more joining us virtually. So welcome to all of you. This session is going to form part of our CLE Cultural Competency / live programs and courses, and the hours will be provided afterwards. So I'm going to invite each one of our panelists to briefly introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about the work that they do. Who wants to go first? Murielle, you're closest to me.
Okay, let's go. So my name is Murielle Jassinthe. I'm DA consultant. So with my company, Black Lantern, I'm also a culture and art interdisciplinary consultant. So what I'm doing pretty much is helping individual business to represent themselves in a pure manner, but also that's what's leading me to wanting to address also more DEI perspective into public relations. So that's what I'm doing, and from my background is literature in a socio-pragmatic manner. So it's when it really strikes me how representation and language had a huge impact, on how we see and perceive people. And as an intersectional human, myself as well, my experience, it's been, as my experience as an activist as well, it's been clear that we needed a little bit more awareness toward what we can do to make everyone feel welcome and participate to our society.
Thank you. Odessa?
Sure. My name is Odessa Odell. I am a partner in the Labor and Employment Group at BLG, and I'm based in Ottawa, but have the pleasure of being here in Iqaluit today. I have a very broad labor and employment practice, largely on the management side. That certainly includes human rights. In recent years, we've definitely seen an increase in helping employers put in place, policies and procedures on EDI, but also implementing that throughout their workplaces. So very thrilled to be here, thrilled to be a part of the conversation, and looking forward to the discussion and any questions.
Thank you so much. Lisa?
Hello, my name is Lisa Spencer. I go by any pronouns. I am here as the communications person for Nunavummi Disabilities Makinnasuaqtiit Society, also known as NDMS. It is an Inuit-led nonprofit based out of Iqaluit. And we service and support Nunavummiut who self-identify as having a disability or a barrier that impedes their participation in their communities, in society, and it lends itself to this conversation specifically around employment diversity and policy. So we support people across the territory, as well as across the lifespan and across different disability diagnosis or sectors.
Fabulous. Thank you so much to each of our panelists. We are actually going to start by watching a quick video. This video was produced as part of the LSN's Barriers to Employment video series that it brought out in its Prevention of Harassment, Access to Justice program, or Access to Justice program under which the prevention of harassment in the workplace project falls. And it was funded by the Government of Canada. And so Alison created 4 videos. One is kind of is a bit of an amalgamation of the discussions that were had. And then the other 3 are individuals who speak, the 3 individuals that you will see. So we're going to watch this video quickly. And that is, I hope, going to kind of frame our discussion, create a really nice opener for us for this discussion.
An inclusive and a respectful workplace is one where people from all different backgrounds, all different ethnicities, cultures, etc. They have a voice. They are listened to. They are allowed to positively contribute to their workplace. They also are allowed to give a voice not only when things are positive, but also when there are negative things happening. And there is respect in the process of them doing so.
A diverse, inclusive workplace would look like employers celebrating people from all walks of life. It would look like colleagues not discriminating against each other, not mistreating each other or holding preconceived notions about someone before that they have had a chance to tell you who they are. Inclusive workplace would look like your differences being celebrated and not picked apart or demeaned.
No matter what the individuals may face, either disability or not disability, we need to look at a bigger picture, how we can assist one another instead of, working away from each other.
A safe workplace would be having representation, perhaps seeing some kind of signage saying that, you're welcome here. It can go anywhere from being something small as validation through a poster to just knowing that you're celebrated amongst your colleagues.
We always need to have fun with one another. That makes a significant health and mental health impact with us. That changes our life, that having fun is important.
When there is harassment or discrimination in the workplace, if you are the victim of harassment or discrimination, just remember that you're not alone. Reach out, talk about it. It's often a challenge for someone who is a victim to actually just open their mouth and speak. But by opening your mouth and speaking about it and seeking help, you actually free yourself.
Okay, so in this video, Stephanie Bernard, Nuka Fennell, and Noah Papazzi share what an equitable, diverse, and inclusive workplace looks like for them. And we hear that it's a space where an employee's voice is respected, where people's differences are celebrated, and where people work with each other rather than against one another. So I'm going to invite each of you to gently ease us into this discussion by please just sharing what your personal and maybe professional interpretation of equity, diversity, and inclusion is. Murielle, will you start for us?
Yes. So already we can look at this slide about diversity, equity, and inclusion. So diversity, which is for me all the ways in which people differ. What is important there too is that acknowledge the intersectional, relation. If everybody has different identities, our identity is made of so many things. Because like at immigration, most of us have just like we came here to work. We've got our families, many experience for different reasons. So already that is diversity. It's a person to recognize it and to accept it from other people without tagging them with our preconceived manner of seeing them. Like everybody has the right to identify himself, herself, themselves the way they want. Equity, the fair treatment of access, opportunity, advancement for all people. One identified cannot predict the outcome, but indeed, like especially in the workplace, I think is really needed to for not only for equal position, but in between positions, the same abilities and possibilities to access professional development, to access opportunity to grow within the workplace, to being challenged of learning new things or taking upon new tasks, by example. And then the inclusion, it's the party of people have power of voice and decision-making authority. So what is important and interesting here into inclusion is it's not only being at the table, but to have an impact on what is happening in the workplace. If there are things to change, as Stephanie Bernard said, it's like, yes, when there's something positive, but also negative, like everybody at its level of work has is knowledge and expertise. So it's important to listen to everyone because they know best what they're doing. Let's say they know best what they're doing. So it's important to listen to them, listen to what they experience, and sometimes is also, and not sometimes, like I think most of the time, so changing a little bit the system. Because it's not because something has been made forever in a way that is the best way. And the better way to know this is to listen of all the employees to do so. And what is interesting there, the relation between diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's not to be really effective, it needs to work hand in hand. And there's interrelation between it. It's not like, oh, there's diversity, so now everything has been achieved. Not at all. It's just we were talking sometime about fluffy beehive. It's like, oh, we have people there of different background, like we've done it. No, if they have no power, they will not listen to. It doesn't change a thing. So it's and there's also not only interrelation between it, but more the diversity and effective equity, more inclusion is rising and achieved, and more than inclusion, more the system can change a little bit, and more diversity you're gonna have, and more equity as well. So there's that interrelation too that it's important to take about.
Amazing. I'm so excited to chat about more of these things a little bit later on. Odessa, would you like to share your definition of these terms?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think for me, I look at it, call it maybe an occupational hazard of being a lawyer, but I look at it in a really practical way. And for me, when I think of, equity, diversity, and inclusion, I'm really thinking of it as an active exercise, which is what takes it sort of beyond the flat line of the framework that we work within, which is often for lawyers, it's the law. So we have the legislation or regulations, we sort of have this floor that we need to work with. And when I advise employers on EDI, it's, okay, often they're looking at what their baseline obligations are. And then we look at how we elevate that concept to actually make equity, diversity, and inclusion more than just a lip service, which I think is, often the flack that we get as a society. Employers certainly get that, it's, oh, you can have a policy, you can have a nice statement on your website, you can have diversity, showing in your brochures or on your website, but that's a very limited and finite sort of exercise. And I think when I look at what takes it to true diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's this active sort of exercise that Murielle sort of spoke about. And it's also a bit like a circle of life, you know, to the point where one impacts the other. So I think from a really practical perspective, when I look at where we are, you know, as employers in particular, and where kind of society is in that respect, we've sort of narrowed in arguably on the diversity piece because it's easy to exhibit tangibly by just having, you know, the right clip art in a brochure, or the right messaging, or, you know, having bilingual or trilingual or those kinds of messaging. It's the equity and inclusion piece that is a step beyond it. It permeates, and it requires an empowerment that from having those, you know, that diverse group present, regardless of how they identify, and welcoming that, it's allowing them to feel that they always have a seat at the table. You know, they always have the voice that they need to sort of elevate just that baseline legal obligation that we all have to something that I think increasingly from an external perspective, we're being asked to aspire to and to implement, you know, but that we can also, as employers in particular, and those that advise employers, can create barriers to almost inadvertently by failing to really understand what the difference is between the baseline legal obligations we have and sort of this elevated idea of diversity, equity, and inclusion that we're now in a great way seeming to aspire to be, but that we need to make sure and take care that we're doing more than just you know, supporting or bolstering the lip service, but that we're actually taking active steps consistently, revising those steps consistently, so that we're able to evolve our workplaces into a place where we can truly say, you know, we support and work towards actively diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Amazing, thank you. I will reserve my comments for after Lisa. Do you want to please?
Yes. Well, I echo many of the statements provided by my fellow panelists, but I do think that diversity, equity, and inclusion are three words that we hear a lot, but we don't necessarily fully understand what each one means. And so we're not sure how to measure or to achieve, or you know, how do we know when we're successful? And I love this visual. And if I may just provide a little bit of an image description here with diversity, which was already described as being the ways in which we differ. There's different colored dots spread out and shared in a small section or area. And I think that this is kind of that idea of inviting more perspectives. And when we say at the table, you know, that's kind of a figurative meaning of like where the decisions happen, where the important conversations are happening that affect all of us, right? So diversity is that first piece, is to make sure that everyone is present, everyone is there. Equity is the same colored dots, but they're linear. They're side by side in this picture. And as discussed, it's fair treatment, access, opportunity, and advancement. It allows everyone to have different ways in which they can communicate or participate. So just because you are there at the table that we talk about, just because you are there invited to be there as part of the decision-making process, doesn't necessarily mean that your perspective will be valued or respected or remembered. So we need to make sure that everyone has equal opportunity. And to do that, we have to provide, you know, different ways of communication, different ways of understanding. You know, there needs to be like a baseline of understanding. And then inclusion is the same colored circles, but they're in a harmonious circle. And in this way, it's not just about people being at the table. It's not just about having people participate in the discussion. It's about having those views respected and shared. It's more than just you know, policies and procedures. It's practice, right? You need to actually do the things that you have written down on paper. And it's about a feeling of safety, psychological safety, physical safety, that idea that you are welcome and you are free to be who you are authentically without any kind of consequence or harm. And that involves fluidity. It's a positive change. It's moving forward. It's constantly evaluating and working together to make sure that what you have now is important, is relevant, is new, is safe. And what that does mean when you have different perspectives at that table, it means that you're not always just going to go with what works. Just because it works doesn't mean that it's inclusive or doesn't mean that it's right.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Lisa. It's very interesting what you mentioned, like just because it works doesn't mean it's inclusive or right, but it doesn't always mean that it works, right? It depends on who is assessing whether it works or not. And that is something that we sometimes forget, but that we really need to bear in mind, is that you also need to take into account who is making the decisions about whether it works or not. So I'm really excited by all of these definitions that you have given me. I hear a lot of action-based words, we've spoken about in preparing for this, we've spoken about the fluffy EDI, we've spoken about, the necessity to put word to action. And we'll get back to that a little bit later. Just going on to our next question here. Today is actually the 41st anniversary of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. In Nunavut, we have the Human Rights Act. And so this legislation is also supported by the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, NURA, and also the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP. We are not only speaking about, therefore, diversity among and between people, but we are also speaking about diversity in the ways that differences are understood and being interpreted on global scales. So on the topic of diversity, and from this perspective of both human rights and labor law, let's explore some of the intersections. Lisa, would you like to go first?
Yes, actually, you had mentioned a whole bunch of different letters and acronyms and initials, and it can get really fuzzy and confusing, especially if you're not involved in law or politics. So it's helpful to know that these are all basically promoting and educating and advocating for the same ideas and concepts. We do have the Canadian Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms, which is it's embedded into our Constitution in Canada. We also have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is kind of a global initiative. We have the Canadian Human Rights Act, which looks for equity and respect and human rights for anyone who has regardless of race, ethnicity, age, sex, sexual orientation, and disability. And then underneath that, we also have the Nunavut Human Rights Act, and many of the provinces and territories have their own different versions of these human rights acts, and they work very similarly to the Canadian Human Rights Act. It's just different federal jurisdictions, different responsibilities, different reporting systems and accountability systems. But ultimately, they're all looking for everyone to have equal participation, equitable accommodations, and inclusion. This is all working towards disability, equity, and inclusion. And that also ties into the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which focuses primarily on First Nation, Inuit, and Métis, and looking at the human rights through a lens of truth and reconciliation. And then we're also looking at the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which is providing a lens to review and analyze how accessible Canada is, right? So these two conventions are not part of our legislation, but they kind of provide a guidebook to interpret the legislation that exists. It can get a little bit confusing, but they're all there for the same reason, and it's there to support and promote diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Thank you. Odessa?
Yeah, so I mean, I'll speak to this from more of a, I guess, a labor and employment law perspective and how it sort of intersects. I mean, we, deal with the Human Rights Act, or as Lisa mentioned, each province and territory has their own sort of version, whether it's the Human Rights Code in Ontario, et cetera. And for the most part, as most of us would know, employment is provincially or territorially regulated. So a lot of the time when we talk about workplaces, it's these various acts and codes that are going to apply. And where, all of these various statutes, and particularly on this list, the Human Rights Act comes into play is it's very explicit in the legislation that it applies to employment. And when we talk about the Nunavut Human Rights Act in particular, compared to some of the other jurisdictions, the way in which employment is defined is quite broad. And it includes, a prohibition on discrimination and harassment in the context of the workplace on any of the prohibited grounds, which is sort of where the human rights intersection comes into play. But I think what's really important from a practical perspective, and I think we sort of alluded to this in the opening question, is the fact that, these pieces of legislation sort of set the floor of what is, what employers have to abide by, what the minimum standards are. But then we have a lot of room from the floor to the ceiling if we're going to talk about, what perhaps an ideal diversity, equity, inclusion really looks like. And I think most would argue, that what is set out as the legislative standard or the minimum standard that's required is really not on its face equity, diversity, and inclusion, even though that's what these and many other conventions and legislation perhaps aspire to or want to promote. And there's all kinds of reasons why that would be the case. A lot of them political, a lot of them policy driven, a lot of them about trying to sort of find that balance between, strapping employers who are the backbone of our economy with too many obligations. And so there's a whole slew of reasons why the legislation is the way it is. And as most of us, particularly in the practice of law would know, legislation is always catching up. It's a very reactive kind of a beast. It's not really a proactive type of beast. So what that really means, in my view, and from a practical perspective, when we're looking at how do we promote equity, diversity, and inclusion in the workplace, is it's almost become a separate conversation from, discrimination and harassment in the workplace, even though there is very much a nexus. Like ED&I to me is the next level above what our minimum statutory requirements are. But because of that, it's often, as we indicated, a fluffy EDI, like it's become a bit of a PR tactic, a bit of a spin kind of tactic. What I find interesting about the Nunavut Human Rights Act in particular is that there are provisions in that statute that actually go so far as to articulate and set out, a prohibition on discrimination and harassment in the context of things like recruitment. It's not just a very generic one statement like it is in some of the other jurisdictions. It talks about certain specific areas, pension and benefits, for example, those kinds of things. So I would argue that there's a little bit more meat there, but it's still the floor. It's still a floor, right? So I think when we talk about true ED&I, and when clients call me and say, we're getting pressure, or there's been something in the media or something of that nature, or in many cases, frankly, we just want to do the right thing. The first step is often this education about what the difference is between the statutory minimums that are in place and the requirements, and how you take that and kind of go one step beyond. And the other big thing is this, I would say a misunderstanding that having a policy will cure all. Policies are certainly helpful tools, but we talked a lot about the use of active language, as we've been talking about so far this afternoon. And I think what we often have to get, clients over, with the help of consultants, with the help of, legal advice, those kinds of things, is how do we take it above and beyond? But then also making clients really aware of what that means, because when you put something into policy that's beyond, or that's considered a greater right or entitlement, you're creating obligations in addition to that. So one of the things that we often have to balance is, how do we put these things in place? Clients want to do the right things, implement true EDI through recruitment, through decision-making, et cetera, but doing so in a way that's manageable, because once it's in black and white, and once they're implementing it, they can actually be held to a much higher standard than they're legally obligated to be held to. And that creates, from a practical perspective, all kinds of issues. So I think that's partly why it's a very gradual approach as people understand what ED&I is beyond what we just hear kind of from a lip service perspective, but then balancing that right in terms of creating new obligations, managing that, and also educating and ensuring accountability and training throughout the ranks, because that at the end of the day is what it's really going to take, to get there. So I would say, in a real succinct nutshell, ED&I as such, the way we've been discussing it, is not law. But it's certainly what we have as law is sort of that first level building block of ED&I, and I think the discussion is increasingly how we kind of take the floor and kind of build into the ceiling of what we actually really want as a society and what we want to have in our workplaces.
Thank you so much. Murielle?
Yeah, and I also found it because during my researches, like what I discovered is pretty much that, DEI is not into really policy. I was like, the only place that I saw that it was maybe in a decision, it was about the discrimination. Discrimination is against the law, discrimination, harassment, violence in the workplace, against the law in human rights, and also labor law. But then I've been thinking, I think that maybe the human level is important when talking with the employer, because about human rights, like equity, what it is for real, maybe we can show like the other
Yes,
side.
absolutely.
I love that picture. It really exemplify in image what it is. So we can see the difference between equality and equity. Equality, everybody start from the same ground, same basis. With equity, we can see that maybe some people need a little leg up, for different reasons. And this different reason is, in fact, I would say not necessarily who they are, but what the system, the way it is required from everyone to be able to attend. That's what I believe. So about human rights, there's a need to have like equal chance, and it came to my understanding that with this different kind of law about like equal opportunities for employment, these kind of things, like there's but there's the economical perspective in this way, that if you can't access the same opportunities to work, same opportunities to professional development and then to growth, it goes against human rights because you don't have the same opportunities. And that is, as we say, when you're kind of set up to fail, it's systemic, like engineering, make it difficult for everyone to attain the same opportunity. So in my head, I think it's important when asking ourselves the question, asking like the employers the question, to give them the opportunity to think about this. It's an important ways to then see how can I make sure that we will change the law into actual action. So what do my employees need? What are their realities? And that is responsible understanding and being sensitive to other people's realities. And it's from there that you work up and you go beyond what the law is providing us, but also and maybe implementing or looking at the law or adorability in that perspective of like, okay, do I really giving the equal chance? Is it like, am I respecting human rights in that situation? And about labor law, I thought like when you don't have equity or inclusion, it takes a toll on the human. You know, if you can't access everything, you don't have the money, etc. But you know, like it's stressful. You know, your physical health, your mental health is affected by it. So as an employer in labor law, you're supposed to making sure that your employees are taken care of, that they are safe in a health and safety manner. They are safe physically and mentally. So it's really important to understand that aspect as well. Like,
yeah, and I think that's an interesting comment, partly because I mean most jurisdictions have seen, you know, their workers' compensation add mental stress as a compensable injury in the last. I mean, this predates the pandemic by and large, but I think what's been interesting about it is while it's become a compensable injury, the denial rates are through the roof. I think like in the first couple of years they were implemented in Ontario, they were in like the high 90s of denial rates for mental stress claims. And I think part of that reason is I think we haven't quite caught up in terms of how those types of claims are managed, how they're measured, you know, how things are, and you can run a very wide gamut of what is mental health and what falls into it. And, you know, I think as a society, we're still struggling with that, but certainly I feel like that's one example of where policy and law has sort of started to try and catch up a bit, but we're fumbling a little bit to try and figure out how to go about it. But it's a very valid point. I think one that most jurisdictions are recognizing.
Yeah, I do think that they're very much part and parcel of the same idea. Just when we're looking at the legislative piece, labor law, when we're looking at human rights, you know, we're looking at how to not cause harm, but that doesn't necessarily tell us how to move forward or how to prevent or how to be proactive. And that's what DEI does. That's what diversity, equity, and inclusion does. It tells you to go beyond that not causing harm to realizing and implementing safety. There's two sides of the same coin, but only one is really legally accountable, whereas the other is more optional, but it lends itself to more successful, stable workforce.
Fascinating. So I'm just gonna stop share here so we can all see each other a bit better. Was that good? Is that okay if we stop share there? I think everyone saw our very nice display of the different platforms and how equality is not enough for everyone to reach the apples on the tree. We need a platform where everyone is met where they are at in order to reach the apples. So in the video that we saw at the beginning, Stephanie mentioned that effective implementation of EDI policies allow for a positive contribution to the workplace by employees. What does positive contribution mean from a human rights and or a labor law perspective? Odessa, will you start for us?
Sure. I mean, I think one of the things I would comment on first is what we talk is even the phrase effective implementation of an EDI policy. I think policy often we get stuck on that. I think it's a much broader, when we talk about EDI as a concept and as a true kind of aspirational goal, I think it really is more than just the black and white. But certainly I think, and some of the other examples, and one of the things I think gets most often missed is this idea of evaluating. And it was kind of touched on early on about making sure that at each turn, you know, how are we doing? What have we achieved? Where are there still barriers? You know, how can we do better? And I think the other thing is that flows entirely in every type of aspect. So a lot of the times when we talk about a simple policy, you know, I think it's to Lisa's point with thou shalt not harm, as opposed to really implementing it across every policy. And I think that's one of the shifts I've certainly seen in my practice in terms of, so when we are looking at anything from a recruiting policy, code of conduct policy, but even really practical operational policies within a company, within a business, that could be, from my perspective as a lawyer, really mundane, because I have no, whether maybe it's a manufacturing plant and I have no idea how they manufacture X, Y, and Z, but when we look at each of those pieces from an ED&I lens, and we not only implement potentially some policy, but also the action that goes with it, I think that's incredibly important. That to me is successful and effective implementation of an EDI policy. It's not just having the EDI policy, it's having that lens reflected on every policy that's being implemented. So, for example, I have clients who in their decision-making processes, they've now implemented sort of a final layer where, when it's before it gets its stamp of approval and is implemented, it's looked at from an EDI perspective, whether that's in consultation with consultants and experts or legal, whatever that is, they're making an active effort to ensure that all their policies that are being reviewed have that sort of viewpoint, so that they can make sure that from any position within the business, they're taking that into account to try and ensure that everyone has a voice, that everyone feels empowered and feels safe. So I think when I think about an effective or positive contribution of an EDI policy, it's when it's literally been infiltrated sort of everywhere. I think, feeling safe and secure and feeling healthy as a byproduct of that safety is what I would feel is a positive contribution to the workplace. And I also think one of the big ones that will become, I think, very important and perhaps a catalyst in terms of the motivating factors for workplaces to get on board with this is not just recruitment, but the retention piece. We saw, we continue to see a lot of labor shortages where baby boomers are the last batch is about to retire. We are going to be in labor shortages for the foreseeable future. And so it's not just about the pretty recruitment brochure to get people to apply or to get people to accept an offer of employment. It's making sure that the workplace is as is broadcasted from the ground up, so that people want to stay and want to be a part of that community going forward. So and those are very practical, I think, positive contributions. But even when we talk about things like business being the bottom line, I mean, training new hires is extremely expensive if you have high turnover. So these things have real tangible economic benefits, notwithstanding the fact that they're the right thing to do, and we have obligations as employers to ensure the health and safety from physical health, but also mental health and human rights perspective within the workplace. So I think those are just a couple of examples of what I would consider a positive contribution from a workplace perspective.
I love that. Thank you, Odessa. It's very much not, I love this idea of not just having it as a policy, but as kind of the basis, the lens from which we view every single other policy. Lisa.
Absolutely. I agree with Odessa. I also wanted to call attention to the fact that Stephanie uses the word allows. It allows us to positively contribute. And the word allow implies permission, implies like a power dynamic where, just because you have something written down, it's a policy, it's a procedure, it's part and parcel of what you do. Is it being implemented effectively where people feel that they can be their authentic self? For me, it's about feeling confidence and not worrying about your job stability or, about consequences. The freedom to disagree or to provide new ideas is really positive participation, right? It's not enough for people to be present at the table for these decision-making processes if they're only expected to nod their head and agree and go along with majority rules, right? How we come up with social innovation, how we come up with change, how we come up with true respect for diversity is, as previously mentioned, is to listen to people, to value their perspective, but to really investigate what part is maybe implied, what part is maybe interpreted differently. Why are people not feeling safe enough to contribute their own ideas, their own perspective? If we have majority rules and the same people are remaining quiet, why is that? That is that idea of power, of disempowerment, of looking at racism, sexism, ableism. It's this societal idea that one person's perspective is valued over another person's perspective. So just because it's written down doesn't mean it's properly implemented. We need to look at that power structure to allow people to make a positive contribution.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah. I really like that. I'm like, yeah, definitely. And I would say, I think that the image that we saw about, everybody for inclusion, like the circle, it's to remind us, as Lisa highlighted, that we can all participate equally. So, like it needs to be into the work culture, into your where you work culture, where everybody, whatever in which area of the hierarchy, because we're really hierarchical, like so everybody's opinion is valued. And as I told you before, everybody's opinion, like they are all like the specialist of what they are doing. And as an employer, the best is to listen to everybody and also to make sure that what they are raising up are important, especially when it's detrimental to their health and safety, for example. Because like profit or productivity in the way that we see it right now is counterproductive. Because if everybody is sick and nobody is at work, because everybody is injured and depressed or left, you won't be you won't be effective. You won't be like a business or a work environment who will meet its goal, right? And you'll need also to train people again. And it takes time, it takes money, you lose all the institutional knowledge at the same time. So that's one, and it's why it's important. And also one other play, quite interesting, and it touched again about human relations. Seeing your employees as people who need to grow. So DHI for me is also making sure that not only that they do what they need to do, but that they learn, and they're always in an ongoing learning experience. And when you believe that someone is able to do anything, they will meet your goal and go further. And then we have retention, then we have like happy employees, then you have that sustainability. So for me, the high really falls there. So you have people, you listen to them, and you make sure that they leave you for somewhere else. Maybe not that they leave you necessarily because like keep them, but if at the end it comes to a point that they changed work, but that's what you need, because you're gonna have other people who will have learned. It's like a trainer kind of perspective. So I think that DHI in these little actions, when people just feel that, okay, like I will keep contributing to my workplace and I feel that it makes a difference,
I love
And for a bit of an added layer, if I may, just for the context of Nunavut, the idea of Inuit Kayamaya Tekengit, the IQ values, part of those involves consensus through collaborative decision-making and discussion. It involves working together for a common cause. It involves being resourceful and innovative and being welcoming. So when we're talking about DEI from a cultural perspective for the territory of Nunavut, we're also looking at cultural sensitivity in Inuit societal values as well. That's DEI in and of itself.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you so much. I'm thinking I'm a visual learner, so I always try to add images to concepts. And while you were speaking, the first time you spoke about this, everybody being their own expert, right? This idea popped into my head. So I'm personally very scared of flying, and somebody very close to me always says to me, Stenette, don't worry about the plane. The pilot is the expert of the plane. You can trust the pilot to fly the plane. You don't have to do any of your little control freak things, trying to think about whatever little superstitions you have to keep this plane in the air. The pilot is the expert of flying this plane. Every person is the expert of flying their own plane, right? So that is wonderful. Thank you so much. So let's come back to this idea of proactivity rather than reactivity. So I invite each of you to share some reflections on workplace accountability, the bystander effect, which came up when we were discussing this panel beforehand, and retaliation. Murielle, will you go first for this?
Yeah. So accountability. I think that, when you're in a workplace and you witness also discrimination or difference between treatments, it affects the people who are experiencing it, but it's also affecting people witnessing it. Because at the same time, like, okay, I'm okay. I'm not having that experience, but you really feel that you're in a fair place, and when can the table turn and now it's you on the wrong side, on the wrong side. So accountability, I think, again, in a human way, what is important is, like, if you see something, you say something. I think that we need, as allies in any situation, to make sure that our co-workers are safe and healthy. We need to make sure that if we see something and our co-worker needs to maybe address it or is not sure how, this is important to let that person know what is the resources, and so we are all accountable to each other, I would say. And so that bystander effect, like, was very interesting, because you see somebody on the floor, like, help me, and everybody is walking around being like, oh, somebody else will do it, like, wow, she's faking, or all of these things. Like, if there's a lot of people witnessing an event, they are less likely to do something because they think that, oh, somebody will take care of it. But we are the people who need to take care of it. Like, the power, one of the power of even of a state, one of the, well, you say there's like 5 or 6, but one of it is the population, and the public opinion. So we are these people, we have that power in our hands. So of course, retaliation, we have like that fear, but it is in the law that retaliation shouldn't be something that happened. So, I think, like, it's the same about like, you know, violence, harassment, bullying. If you don't say something, it will keep going. So it's the same way with DI, but not only of being that person who will be reactive to a situation, but being also like the colleague who will support your fellow colleagues to be heard. Like you were in a meeting, if someone is talking and then nobody's listening to that person, you're like, okay, yeah, like I don't know, like Luisa was saying something, like tell me more, Luisa. Like, yes, that was a good idea. Or talking to the directors or other people in different levels, like, I think that person can do a good job there. Hey, that person would be the best. So it's also this, like creating circumstances where everybody can participate the way they best can. Yeah.
Thank you, Lisa.
Yeah, just to build on to some of those ideas, I think, you know, when we look around and we assume that if something is that big of a deal, somebody somewhere would say something or do something. And if there is no action, then we second guess and we don't trust our instinct and we might remain quiet. And that can actually cause harm. And a big part of that is because we take our social cues from everyone else's behavior, right? And, you know, we don't know what we don't know. I, as a white person, don't understand the feeling of receiving racism. I, as, you know, various other parts of my identities don't necessarily align with different forms of discrimination. And so I might be hesitant to bring something up because I don't want to be wrong or I don't want to cause offense. And that hesitancy can also perpetuate and, you know, enforce those discriminatory ideas. So when we think about, you know, allyship, when we think about, you know, amplifying the voices of others, when we think about, you know, advocating for people's rights, we quite often think about, you know, the person that is very much the loudest person in the room, right? And that's not necessarily the case. We don't have to come at it with aggression. We don't have to come at it, you know, accusatory. We can come at it with curiosity, as was mentioned. Tell me more about that. How did that make you feel? Or, you know, do you have anything to add? You know, or even privately, hey, I noticed this happened, you know, is there anything that's, you know, happened that made you feel a certain way? Is there anything I can do to support you? Because, you know, when we talk about retaliation in the work environment, there's this very real possibility that if you shake the boat too much, you might lose your job, or you might lose out on that promotion, or you might, you know, look unfavorable to the boss. So there's the hesitancy to speak out or to advocate against something or to disagree in general. And we need to collaboratively work against that. And if we as the people, as Odessa, or as Murielle was saying, you know, we support each other and, you know, we work together and we lift each other up in that way, then we can prevent that from happening.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Odessa.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one that we already have a bit of a framework built into the regulations in some respects, and it's limited to this idea of, you know, harassment, discrimination, and the requirement, you know, health and safety sort of aspect. But I mean, the regulations and best practices, you know, when we talk about policies that are implemented in these areas, I mean, we already have in law the concept of vicarious liability in the context of employment. You know, if managers and supervisors are made aware of something, you know, that might be discriminatory or that might constitute workplace harassment, they have obligations to report that properly, because that can draw liability to the workplace. And those types of things incentivize workplaces and employers to have the right mechanics in place, because there are liabilities attached to them. Similarly, as Murielle also alluded to, you know, there is a protection from reprisal for people who participate, not only report, but who maybe just participate as a witness, or, you know, somebody who may know something and might be able to contribute to an investigation. So I think in a lot of respects, sort of framework of these concepts is already there, and a lot of employers who are adhering to their statutory obligations to have these policies in place, these policies by law have to have these concepts, a process of reporting, a training requirement. All of these are legislative required. So to me, it's a good framework and foundation for workplaces to take it a little bit further, in terms of not just being the reactive piece, but the more proactive. So getting into not just supporting somebody in reporting something or making an observation or identifying an issue, but even doing so before there is a big issue to identify, or there is something that's gone too far. So I think every now and then the law has things in place that allow for a little bit of proactivity, and in my experience, health and safety is one of the areas where that is often. And lo and behold, that's where these sort of concepts and legal obligations come from, are our health and safety regulations. So I think that allows for a more proactive management of these issues and engagement on these issues. But again, as we've kind of already alluded to, policy is just the black and white first step, and that really needs to be taken off the page, implemented through things like training, through supportive experiences when somebody does report or wants to have a conversation. I think another opportunity is to have the inclusion of not only a formal reporting process for things that can't be resolved, but also sort of an informal, more of an interpersonal education, supportive kind of based approach to dealing with issues that arise in the workplace. So I think we do have the bones, we do have the framework for these kinds of more proactive concepts. But of course, it's again about taking sort of what that floor has to be, and implementing it and sort of expanding it out to be a bit more proactive and potentially, beyond just discrimination and harassment, but more into concepts that are EDI based.
Thank you so much. I'm thinking about this this idea of rocking the boat, and usually whenever we hear someone's rocking the boat, you think that is a negative thing, right? But what is rocking the boat? It's implementing change, it's effectuating change. And so I'm wondering if we rephrase, change the narrative around this idea of rocking the boat. Maybe that is a necessity rather than something negative that needs to be stopped and not done. So we have 10 minutes left. I really want to make sure that we have some time for comments and reflections from our participants. So I'm going to ask our last question. It's a big question. I don't think we have 5 minutes is not enough, but I think we've had a really good lead up to this question. So this event was very boldly named Diversity Beyond Policy. How would you reflect on this? And what does diversity beyond policy mean? And how do we get there? We've spoken about some of them, but let's try and maybe do a good summary. What does it mean and how do we get there? Who wants to go first?
Yeah, I started because I want to jump on something you said. I was like, oh my God, that is totally number 5 question. Yeah, no, but let's say you talk about the fact of being proactive. We talked about that, but also teaching, raising awareness there is important. So probably in that matter, it will be also to train the employer in certain areas, which are not necessarily directly on DEI, which would be beneficial as well, but also on human resources, on cultural sensitivity, on different aspects of what they need to know and understand to better support all employees in a DEI perspective. So let's say that for me, that is like beyond policy, because for now, the policy sets a ground, but there's gap when we've got difficulty like to grasp and to know how can we make it happen, how can it be really effective. So I would say like with more training, appropriate training, but also by, well, the policy are supposed to be implemented into action, as we said. So probably also into process, having like proper policy legislation and process on how are we gonna make it happen. Have some guidelines, true guidelines that people can follow in and to implement that DEI in a way that everybody will be able to contribute, feel safe, and why not changing the system, taking the table, trying it. Maybe do we need a table? Like maybe we don't need a table. Maybe we need something new. So and I'll say like rocking the boat. If the boat doesn't is not being
Stabilized.
yeah, like to go somewhere, the boat need to move. So is it really a problem to wreck it?
That's a very good point. And it sounds like you're very much describing a holistic approach.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking very much, we are in Nunavut, coming back to Inuit societal values, the IQ principles. It's a holistic approach. And yeah, maybe that's exactly what they need. Odessa, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that takes diversity beyond policy is a certain level of intention. So I mean, going back to sort of the IQ principles, well, I mean, it's not going to work if it's not really thoughtful and intentional in terms of, what is the workplace we're dealing with? Who is there now? Who should be there? Like, how do we broaden that? How do we make it so that there's a group beyond who's there? What other things do we need to hold into account? So I think intentional is one. I think evaluation is incredibly important because ideally, when we implement these kinds of measures, we end up with a more diverse workplace. We end up with a more inclusive. Then we're in a new norm. So then we have to evaluate, does our policy, do our practices, does our culture reflect where we are today, not necessarily where we were when we started, and then what do we need to fine tune and maneuver and set new standards to sort of take us from there to keep going. So I think having a policy that you're going to review once, do your little internal PR thing and say, yay, we've done it, and then never touch it for 10 years is just not going to be sufficient. So I think it's intentional, having evaluation. I think training and education and experience is incredibly important. And then I think all of that, we often hear about, in my practice, I hear a lot about pushback or how do we make this so that people are implementing it or that they're, being trained properly, that they're being held to account. And that's where, to me, the law can sort of be of assistance. How do we enforce these policies? How do we make sure employees are adhering to them? How do we ensure that managers are promoting them and actually living them, and how do we manage those kinds of pieces, or how do we sell it? Well, the law kind of gives us sort of that foundational framework to say, these are not just pulled from the sky ideas. We do have these legal obligations that sort of set the floor that we're building from. And so I think all of those things take it off the page and into action, and I think that's what it's about, fundamentally.
Thank you. Lisa.
Yeah, I think the only way that I can contribute is to just kind of sum up some ideas with this idea. I heard tokenism and I heard check the boxes. Calling back to Odessa mentioning, diversity being, having different people from different racial ethnicities on your pamphlet, right? When we think about diversity, we think about, even with our imagery, we had different colored dots, but it's not just about what we see. It is that person's experience, they're the sum of all their parts, their culture, their education, what they've learned through their own lived experience. And we need to value equally all of those attributes, and how it can positively contribute to the workforce. So when we look at, how much education someone has had, or what language they speak, or what religion they follow, people are more than just checkboxes or a list of different identities. It is a wonderful tapestry of all of those together. And the only way to kind of pull that apart or to understand it is to engage in conversations and to get to know one another and, your values, your morals, your beliefs, in addition to your experience, because it's not just having different people with different skin colors in the same room is going to equal social innovation and economic growth. It doesn't work that way. You have to have full participation, respect, and values shared. So to go beyond policy, diversity needs to be more than what you can see or what you assume or what is on that checkbox. It needs to be about what everyone brings from, past to present. And future ideas. It needs to encompass all of that. It's human connection.
It's human connection. I would not have been able to say it better myself, which is why I got panelists. Thank you so very much. Everyone, we are at 1:29, and I'm respectful of the fact that everyone has to get back to work probably after this. So I'm going to reserve comments and questions. If you have any comments or questions for myself or any one of our panelists, you can please just email them to support@lawsociety.nu.ca. They will get to us. I will make sure that they get to everyone. There are some further reading resources that Murielle has very graciously put together for us that is on the website. I am so thankful for all of you taking the time to come here today, for Lisa, for you to joining in.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Absolutely.
It's been absolutely wonderful. I'm so glad to have had this conversation with you and to have learned from you and to have shared this experience. So thank you so much. I wish everyone a wonderful day, and I hope to see you at our future events. Have a good day.
Good day.
Let's see here, we have Hoyana. Thank you for the presentation. I really like the EDI diagram with the dots and colors. Nice way to illustrate each there. Thank you so much, Nuka. Really, really appreciate that.